Thanks very much, Amir. And I'm not really sure why you invited me back to Torrent Farmers again for another session at Ag Days, other than part of that is that my position's not been replaced. And so I think that you've decided to have a pensioner here today to update on some of the things I've spoken about in the past. But with that title that she assigned me, I think back in August, that return on investment, that's not my language. I don't usually talk that part of economics. There's some other economic instruments or parameters we talk about with fertility. But I'm thinking that what you were getting at is that, John, you haven't done a good enough job explaining some of the economics of fertilization and what are good returns. And so I'm going to work through with some of you'll see some data that I will work at and apply some economic instruments to it. And then also look at, the first part is, balancing your nutrient profile in the soil, but basically taking into account your soil supply before you start investing in your fertilizer dollars. So let's start. If there's going to be an economics talk, I'm going to have to start with crop prices. And this I borrowed from one of our cost of production, Manitoba Agriculture's cost of production. Just looking at the trend over the last 5 years of prairie crop prices. I don't know where it's going to go from there, although they put a projection for 2025 on there. But it's tailing off. 2022 was when we saw some peaks in prices. Since then, that's tailing off. But really, how does that relate to what fertilizer prices are and the costs that we're going to have to deal with? Alberta Agriculture is good enough to track prices here. This is the 5-year running price of urea on the left and MAP on the right. And like I was mentioning it to Tom, the other speaker said, it is uncanny how that red line, how nitrogen prices tend to follow crop prices. And basically the way that I see it in my world is that if crop prices are high, farmer demand is high for nitrogen, and fertilizer manufacturers are pretty shrewd at seeing that, and so that general trend tends to follow. So you can see the urea prices have slackened off versus 2022 in comparison, but the phosphate prices have not. I said, what's with this? This is kind of one of these perfect storms when crop prices going one way and fertilizer not quite following. And that reminds me of my perfect storm in my life this weekend. Say, well, remember it was windy on Friday. Sunday, I get this text from my son that he reads something on Facebook. That ice fishing shack, which way are those holes supposed to be? Probably supposed to be down. So anyways, yeah, that was our Sunday afternoon, was with son-in-law and son trying to put that turtle upright again. Anyways, sometimes weather or market forces disrupt your ways. So the challenging times, we have uncertain crop prices and markets, modest with nitrogen and high with phosphorus fertilizer rates. And so how do we get good returns on that? And how you get good returns it depends, and we have to really know what the soil's contribution is going to be. And a very simple or general approach is we need to know what the crop nutrient need is. We subtract what the soil supplies, and the remainder is the fertilizer requirement. That's pretty simplistic looking at that. My son is doing his MBA, so Amir, I talked to him. I said, what's this ROI they're talking about? He said, oh, it's return on investment, and he talked about having to include interest rates and whatever in there. But really, it's simple enough. It's just what's the increased dollars that you achieve by using the input, less the cost of that input, divided by the cost of the input. So that will give you a percentage, a return on investment. But when it comes to fertility, it's really not that easy. Usually we're used to doing annual return on investment, like short-term inputs, like seed and chemical and things like that. We expect we've got to recover all those costs in the year of application. That's probably the way it is, that we should be treating nitrogen, looking at an annual return on investment. But a lot of our fertility nutrients are residual in nature. So here we've got to be looking at an extended period. Over what period should we look at for some payback? And it's nice to have a baseline to compare to, use of that input versus not. And not many people are willing to do that when it comes to nitrogen or other rates like that. So sometimes our baseline level for comparison, we need to adjust that. And I'll do that as we go through some of this. I want to address that balance part of the title right off the hop. If life was this just simple, we wouldn't need a soil test. If all we really needed to do to grow crops was look at what is the yield produced, what have I carted off to the elevator, and I just replace those nutrients. And so, I don't know, is anyone using this new Prairie nutrient removal calculator? Thank you, Christian. I've got one believer in the group here, but this is something that many of us across the prairies, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, in conjunction with nutrient staff and some of the associations, we collected up hundreds of grain samples for about 14 different crops across Canada or across the prairies. Let me try the pointer here. And in this case, it's spring wheat. You set the yield, 75 bushels per acre, and it will put out for, this was the typical removal amounts of the nutrients. One of the trends that we saw is that our nutrients removal today, the concentration per bushel actually tends to be quite a bit less than historically. Our crops are meaner and leaner, and they're achieving high yields with less removal per bushel. Still more per acre because yields have increased. But here's a resource to use. But if you were to fertilize simply with this approach, if your soils are low to begin with, then they'll perpetually remain low locked in that category because you're not building them. And if soils are high or generously supplied naturally in these nutrients, there's little yield and certainly no economic benefit to applying more. So we consider this to be an important supplement, but certainly it's no replacement for soil testing. For soil testing, get down to it, it's the chemistry of the analysis and kind of the inventory of what's there, and then based on the nutrient and the interpretation, you will get a recommendation on what you need to supplement. Look at nitrogen first, and I'm going to borrow from one of those previous soil test companies. AgVise, based in North Dakota or the northern Great Plains, does a pretty good job of producing annual summaries. And if you look at how what the carryover nitrogen was after wheat this past year, I'm going to try to zero in on Manitoba down here. Some varied levels within the province, actually lower in the east, a bit more carryover in the west. But those numbers in themselves, what are they telling us? If I look historically over the last 25 years, an average number of 28 pounds residual is very much on the low side. You can pick out the drought years. Under drought years, when we have lower yields, we have more residual nitrogen carryover. So this is telling me, if I'm looking back and not knowing anything about yields this past year, I have to say, wheat yields were in line and we probably generally had good removals. Looking specifically here, they're looking at the ranges of nitrogen. And if you look here, this is the low category. No, this is the very low category of carryover. Look at these orange bars. 70% of the soils in that catchment area are showing that it's low to very low. So signal being that nitrogen fertilization is going to be pretty important on those soils, and hopefully the return on your investment will be very good on nitrogen because of that. Nitrogen, again, back to kindergarten here on simplifying this, but really the rate that's needed, it's the crop demand, which is based on your anticipated crop yield times whatever factors have been developed for your area, so amount of nitrogen per bushel. And then from that, we typically subtract first the soil test nitrogen, any previous crop credits, manure, organic matter. Do we give organic matter credits? You know, we would if we had any confidence in them. Recent studies by Don Flayton and his team working on hard red spring wheat and corn looked at a range of organic matter tests or estimates of mineralization. Not only were they not very good, often they gave the wrong answer. We had cases where we had wheat yields responding very well to nitrogen, but some of these tests were saying, you don't need any nitrogen. That they tend to be befuddled by some of our high naturally organic matter levels that we have. We do know that organic matter puts out nitrogen, but that's what we don't control that. If we have warm, moist conditions, we can get lots of mineralization. If we get cool, drier conditions, that's baffled. So Amir here, I was going to take a $20 bill out of my pocket, I was going to give to you, and just before I gave it to you, I was going to take it away. Because the other part of the equation we often ignore here is that crops mineralize and give up nitrogen, or organic matter or crop residue gives up nitrogen as it decomposes, but at the initial phase of decomposition, it generally immobilizes or takes nitrogen. In past studies, they found that the two kind of balance each other. So if I'm going to give you a nitrogen credit, I'm going to take most of that money away again because the crop residue is going to immobilize it. So we find that rather than trying to guess and estimate what's there, unless you've done some soil testing in the past and find consistently higher nitrogen carryover than what you're expecting for the yields, that would be maybe your personalized mineralization numbers. Otherwise, hard to estimate from a test. And these are some typical amounts of nitrogen demanded by different crops in yield models. So we're a starting place for deciding what you need. But we were lucky in the about 2008, fertilizer prices took off and crop prices were not really keeping pace. And a lot of the US states, and I'm sure in Ontario, Tom, they have a lot of interest in the economic models about how do I optimize my nitrogen dollars in crop. And so where we had access and developed, we had these yield curves or yield response models. In ours, we were able to soil and fertilizer on the bottom. And here's some, I think it said here, 25 studies with non-moisture limiting yields under dry conditions. There was 67 studies. And all about 150 prairie studies looking at that gave us some confidence on how we might see a generalized yield curve would be. And now I can apply some economics to this based on crop prices and fertilizer prices. Okay, one person was using the calculator. Has anyone ever seen this before, this nitrogen rate calculator? Excellent. Oh my, a fan club is here. Spoke about this for years. It's only in hard times that people dust off this nitrogen rate calculator. I do because it allows us to evaluate economic scenarios of pricing of fertilizer and crop. So what I've done is you input, and it's on the website, nitrogen, just Google Manitoba nitrogen rate calculator. But nevertheless, I've borrowed costs from our Manitoba Agriculture recent cost of production and put in here, you put in your fertilizer cost, you would input expected crop prices, and then you let that crop model and Excel program generate the most economic rates. So a little bit on this table. It gives a range. First of all, this is the wheat prices. It locked in at 8. This shows the impact of if wheat prices are much depressed or if they're increase a bit. The blue cells are the ones where the economic return is maximized. So the maximum return of additional yield in that price, less the cost of the nitrogen. And in this instance, at $8, the optimum is here. 100 pounds of nitrogen will be producing just about 63 bushels per acre. As crop prices change, there is a modest swings in the rates of nitrogen, but they're only modest changes that result. So if I put this in a table to compare some different scenarios here, and I'm calling this kind of the current numbers, modest fertilizer, modest crop price of $700 a ton for urea and $8 wheat, optimum nitrogen rate 100, yield 63, and this is the net return to nitrogens. That's for all the nitrogen. The way that calculator works, my return on investment on the last dollar that I spend on nitrogen gives me $1 of crop. So that means that any more nitrogen that I spend on that is costing me more than I'm gaining. But it's running up to $1 per dollar on that last dollar. But overall, the return to nitrogen is 131. Or if I calculate an ROI, which if you haven't figured out now, I think it's kind of a useless number, it gives me 189, whatever that is. Okay, and if we look at, if we have high fertilizer prices, high crop prices, my optimum rate really hasn't changed, hasn't changed the yield. My profitability's increased a little bit because of the higher crop prices. If we go to more of the storm, high fertilizer prices and crop prices stay where they are, then it backs off my nitrogen rate a bit. There's some slight yield impact, and largely because of the fertilizer costs being high, our profitability net return is reduced. If we end up getting a dry year and I have to slide down to that other yield curve, it actually doesn't change the optimum nitrogen rate that much, but my yields are reduced because moisture is limiting, and of course, so your profitability net return is reduced. But this is how this instrument works. That allows you to compare some different cost price scenarios. The main thing is, across a range of events, that nitrogen rate does not change very much. It tends to keep you up fairly high on that theoretical yield curve. Here's that same calculator for canola, looking at the $13.25 a bushel projection. And again, the change in the dollar per bushel. We can see, is there wide changes? Well, these nitrogen rates are pretty high. Oh, I forgot to say this. Presuming that I have 30 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. So that was a presumption with the previous one also. And we see it does change these optimum rates somewhat. But at 13.25, it was, the computer says, well, based on the 34 studies, we're an average yield about 51 bushel per acre with that nitrogen rate. And if you look, so it's modest fertilizer and modest crop prices, my returns would be $148. We just work through the same scenario. Wouldn't that be nice? $18 canola. But again, it basically just counterbalances that high fertilizer price here. Fertilizing with a very similar amount, there's not much yield lost by backing off there. Profitability is good. But if a high fertilizer and a modest canola price, that's where it starts backing off my nitrogen rates slightly. And then we can see there is some yield impact, but we're operating at the top of the yield curve. That's where these models will tend to keep you. They're not going to slide off to where you're suffering a lot of yield impact when reducing rates. The one thing that, because of the, if you want to exercise, like this is a hidden sheet behind. Regis Karaman has developed this for us. This is if you want to exercise some greater risk management with the last dollar spent. I said those previous values were all spent on where you're getting $1 for the last dollar you spend on fertilizer. If you want to say, you know, I'm willing to back off a bit to where I'm getting $1.25 or $1.50 back. And I'm told that that's how Saskatchewan developed a number of their recommendations years ago with that type of thinking. And so this calculator shows that, well, a previous slide showed that 150 pounds of nitrogen was a rate that gave me about $1 back, in this case $1.09 for the last dollar spent on nitrogen. If I want to demand more return on that, I can back off and see those. Again, you're not maximizing your return, but you're maximizing your return on that last dollar spent. Okay. Took me this long to get to the 4R picture, Tom, and you're going to talk about this, I'm sure. So, but, you know, here I have talked a lot about rate, but, you know, there are other rights also. This is the framework that an approach used by industry and government encompassing for nutrient management to achieve responsible nutrient use. And I just have a slow, sorry, I mean, a slow, but a short reminder about the importance of source, time, and place. And for this, I'm just borrowing one of the slide sets from Chris Holzapfel that runs the research program at Indian Head, and he looks at many of these 4R, placement, timing, management systems, and this is an example from the 2019 studies that they've done, and looking at, you know, side-banded nitrogen in the green versus fall broadcast versus spring broadcast in the blue. Overall, showing here, yes, side-banded in the spring has a, you know, a significant yield advantage over the other, but we do have some enhanced efficiency fertilizers here, and some of them, here's in the fall broadcast, some of them may be important there to help narrow the gap, not close the gap, but narrow the gap, so there are places where these can fit. Just looking at yield only, when you protein is often even more discerning when we're looking at nitrogen with wheat, and we can see here that, yeah, this is where you're really punished with those broadcast applications. I was talking to a farmer in the hallway the other day. I mean, he was talking about his neighbor broadcasting nitrogen in the fall just before the snow and harrowing it in and grow good crops. We can still grow very good crops. It's just that we're not going to grow them at the same rate of nitrogen. You just need to keep those nitrogen rates higher if you're going to choose a less efficient for placement, timing of nitrogen. Still grow good yields, just need more nitrogen. And this I'm wanting to show some farm data of what some of these impacts might be of either looking at increasing nitrogen or fertility levels a bit versus decreasing. And what better than on-farm data, but on-farm research. This is done by Adam Gurr and his brother-in-law Steve, AgriTruth Research, where this is their plot seeder, their 60-foot plot seeder, and essentially it's using field-scale equipment. This trial itself is just west of number 10 highway on the Brookdale Road on Newdale clay and loam soils, and we're going to look at here's a picture of our famous Newdale soil profile here in the field, and what the standard treatment would be for that is rates of 95 to 120 pounds of nitrogen for wheat, higher for canola, standard phosphorus rate for all crops, and some sulfur for canola. And compared to that, looked at a 30% reduction. Some people were suggesting that, we really don't need that much fertilizer. Maybe we can go with 30% less. You say, well, okay, what would the impact be of doing such? And the other is, well, on the flip side of that, what if I increase rates 30% above the base level? So these are interesting, those studies. And if I was a small research station at Ag Canada or the university, I would do that for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And this is what you would find and this is the first 3 crop years following that type of an approach. And because on-farm testing can be so definitive or accurate, we can even identify significant differences even when they aren't very large. And that's what those letters are describing above there. But over the case in the first 3 years, there's not a lot of yield difference to be seen there. And I say, well, that's why when my pension starts to run dry and I need to bottle up maple syrup as an elixir for increasing crop yields that allow you to reduce rates 30% and get the same yield, I will pick farms like this to promote that too, where I've got a good, what I call resilient system, long-term zero-till crop, residue return, good fertility, because I can do some goofy things for the first few years with very little yield impact. But if I want to keep the farm, I better not keep doing them. And so this, we take out, I ran out of room on my graph here, so I've had to put the most recent yields below. But as we go out in time, we can see that those yield differences become rather strikingly more apparent. The high yields are wheat there. We have some canola years. We have, of course, the soybean year. Soybeans, what a dud as far as being responsive to nutrients. It just doesn't respond to nutrient applications. It's a nice crop to grow if you want to save fertilizer dollars. It's simply going to tap into what's in the soil, but it's not going to respond to nutrients in the studies we've seen. But the other is canola and wheat, quite responsive. But what's the economics in that? This is the returns per acre. These are the returns less the fertilizer cost. So we could see for the first few years, it was actually probably more profitable to simply back off those rates. And if you're stuck or your brother-in-law is stuck and doesn't have inputs for this year, you can say, well, if you've had a good resilient system in the past, you may weather a year or two by backing off some nutrients, but it's not sustainable in the long term. Good profitability comes with a better nutrient program. And so, Amir, your wish is granted. Here's some economics to go with that. It just looks at what were the total fertilizer rates applied, the cost per acre over those 10 years, the extra revenue, and so this is the revenue less the fertilizer cost. It's about a $700 per acre difference between there, and compared to the standard, reduced rate, my profitability is about $300 less. But if I want to compare the return on investment versus doing the low rate alone, you can see the return on investment over 10 years is good or better by keeping my rates better matching some of the removals or matching the yield potential that's being produced. These are under very high yield conditions. Like some of our research plots don't achieve some of those 100 bushel plus wheat yields, but very good, what I call crop husbandry, timing of inputs and a good production system can lead to some of those yields. So the lessons I see, short term, there's some flexibility there to maybe go with some deceivingly good economics, to go with reduced rates. But the first thing you lose out on is protein when you reduce nitrogen. The other thing is the long-term economics were better with the staying the course with the moderate or higher rates. Some of the higher rates are because of some of those high yields being produced. One thing that was very apparent from this was the nutrient balancing and the effect on phosphorus. When you're producing high yields like that, is put a lot of pressure on phosphorus levels. On these clay loam soils with potassium in excess of 300 to 350 parts per million, Adam's just coasting right along without needing to apply potassium yet because of the very generous soil supplies that naturally occur with some of our clay loam soils. But what about those other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and others? If they're residual nutrients with longer term, we need to look at what is the longer term return on investment. Tom, you may recognize this slide. It's one I borrow from the IP&I soil fertility course that we still teach. And it looks at a way to look at residual nutrients in the soil. And down here it talks about, what's your soil test level, but also what's your flexibility that it offers in your fertility programming. So as soil test levels increase, the risk of soil fertility limiting yield is quite reduced. If the soil test levels are low, well, then there's a higher risk that yields might be limited. So you say, well, give that to me. That's what I want to have. But the next part is, well, but this is the cost. This is the risk of recovering those fertilizer costs in that year of application. And it says, yeah, in the year of application, putting fertility on low testing soils, we can expect, and we would expect to get very good returns. But as soil test levels increase, the returns that we're getting to cover that are often not met. And it's a long-term strategy, unlikely to cover in the year of application. And this lends to the two approaches that we tend to use, particularly with phosphorus in much of North America: a sufficiency approach, a build approach, or a blend of those. And just a very quick review is what the historical prairie short-term sufficiency approach is just applying enough phosphorus for a good yield in that year. And it does. It maximizes returns for that fertilizer dollar that year, but it doesn't consider residual amounts. It's what people tend to use for short-term land tenure or rented land if cash flow is limited, or maybe a year like this, high fertilizer costs relative to crop price, or if you're in a lower value, lower yield cropping systems. What we used to think about the prairies when we were achieving much lower yields of cereals and canola. Might not be today's reality though. So we now look at the long-term sustainability approach where soil test levels are built into maybe a medium-high range to where phosphorus is not as yield limiting, but it's not going to maximize profit the year of application. So the short-term return on investment probably not going to be so good because you're investing in the future. Presumably phosphorus isn't lost. It's suitable for long tenure if you've got capital during the building phase, and presumes that phosphorus cost when you're doing this is lower than it's going to be in the future. So the sufficiency approach is what's typically printed in our guide and others, and it's a really good approach to use in a year like this. If crop prices are modest but phosphorus is high, it may be something that you may choose to use. But what we've observed is that with today's crop yields, these tend to lead to phosphorus depletion in the soils. Those rates are not sufficient to keep up. So on the flip side is, what about this philosophy of building soils into a better working range? And we don't have a lot of data on that, so I'm going to show you some older and then some more recent. This water is too valuable. They're charging $4.50 a bottle. Can't afford to be spilling it like that. the classic work done in Saskatchewan, I'm told it was done, initiated in the late 70s when phosphate prices were very low. And so I thought, what happens if we, in this typical wheat system, if we batch apply some high rates and see what happens? And so they did this for 5 years, 6-year studies. They did 5 years of wheat following applications of 160 and 82 pounds of phosphate per acre. And then over the 5 years, they produced these yields. And I'm just going to look at these, not without looking at the annual applications, but just look at these. But look at the yield levels that were created with those initial applications. If I look at that alone and apply even some of today's price economics of crop price and others, you know, that 82 pounds put on there made a tremendous difference in yield. This is the average of 5 years, so cumulative is more than that. Huge return on investment over the long term by that batch application. Similarly, the doubling that rate, again, gave a very impressive return on investment on doing that. But again, I'm not seeing that just all in the year of application. That's weighing it out. That's a long-term return on investment. I don't know if we would see anything close to that today because they were starting with some very low testing soils. But this was very intriguing to see that, yes, we can do that, and we have built different yield levels with that. If you look at the seed place fertilizer, the response to that on those soils that remained low, were kept low, we can say, well, there is some very impressive profitability response to seed place fertilizer on that low testing soil. On the one that has been built up, well, there's still a return to nitrogen, still positive, 40%, but less. And on the soil that had been built up higher than that, it was actually a negative return. The extra yield I was getting was costing more than it was returning. So this really shows, you know, this is why it's good to have soil testing so that you can apportion those fields of yours that maybe lower testing, because they're going to be ones with a very profitable response. Those that are already in a high range, you may continue to apply maintenance approach, but don't be expecting big returns on investment with that. Your main returns are going to be by apportioning those dollars directing to low test fields. Okay, and now what's a modern approach to that? Again, looking at batch applications to just get us up to a level, and what's some of the economics with that? Again, the Agri-Truth group, Adam Gurr and Stephen, north of town here, number 10 highway, and there's four strategies: sideband, the standard rate, medium, so band applied, 175 pounds P205, so it's double that rate in MAP. And the high build was 350 pounds P205, or the fourth, variable rate based on a SWAT type approach. And we soil tested, and so after 7 years, you say, well, so how long did those yields differ? And we were really astounded by this. We didn't expect this type of yield response the first year, seeing, you know, up to 18 bushel yield response to doing this. And part of that is, as bit before, probably some of the nitrogen contribution in that. But we do see significant difference showing up and following canola crops. That's such a good wheat crop this year showing up. Canola, soybeans, they really don't care. But again, this past year in wheat, we're seeing that those yields, again, reflecting that, building that base level of fertility up. If we look at the economics with that, the gross returns, so this is the returns less the cost of the MAP. We can, here I've done the math for it, the returns were $41 a head with the medium build, $103 a head with the higher build, or $124 a head with the variable rate or directed phosphorus. And these were the ranges that those were built into. So we went from a low testing soil built to a medium range versus a high. So a kind of mission accomplished there. We'll just see how long we continue doing some of that. But I'm not recommending these batch applications because it may fit certain situations. So it may be suited for low-cost phosphorus, if you've got access to manure or biosolids. But the other approach is, why not pay with profitability as you go, or be opportunistic and just apply annually a bit more to help you to reach a target phosphorus level. That way, it could be flexible. In profitable years, you build more and back off when there's tighter margins, and stretch your period of building to what works. Don't need to do it all in 1 year. This just shows some of the cost of production. Information here shows that, the year like this, you've got very high-priced phosphorus. That's, if I'm talking wheat, it's costing over 140 bushels to buy a ton of phosphorus, whereas a year like this, 2021, 50 bushels is buying that ton of phosphorus. That would have been an opportunistic year to look at that type of approach. We and soil test companies, they've got ways. If you select a build opportunity within their programs, they will have a bit of a formula like this that runs in the background that takes your basically takes your soil test you want to go to, where you are currently, the amount of phosphorus that's required to move it by 1 point. Say here, you're going to do this over 10 years, and we need to match the removals that are being removed by your crops. So rather than putting on, simply removal rate would be about 39 pounds of phosphorus. If you're going to build your phosphorus to that extent over 10 years, you're going to need to apply around 74 pounds of phosphate. And again, we would say this is an approach to doing that. But it should remain flexible based on profitable years. You can meet that. Years like this, you may choose to slow down that build. Very sorry. I want to move on to, what about this phosphorus? How many phosphorus, what's the soils are testing in this range? This is this 15 part per million target we were talking about for a high range for us. We can see some of the corn, soybean, potato growing areas. 37% of those fields are testing below that. But in other areas, we have more fields that are testing low. I would say that for those type of approaches, you use them on your fixer-upper fields. Many of your fields, you build them into a good working range. You apportion those dollars towards fields that are testing lower. So a summary for some phosphorus rates is basically this bottom line. The fertilizer price is high, and soil test is phosphorus to medium, or medium to high. We could do very well with band rates of phosphorus at 15 to 25 pounds. For cereals and canola, for soybeans and flax, short-term approach, they're not going to respond. They're going to see very little response, and so you could save your phosphorus dollars there in a short-term survival approach. Other nutrients, P.Ag, or potassium, sulfur, and micronutrients are just as essential, but responses are much less frequent. Just because of some of the natural supply that our soils have. So we would say applied according to provincial guidelines. For potassium, it's fairly simple. If soil test levels are less than 200 parts per million, corn and potatoes demand potassium. For most other crops, if they're testing below 125 parts per million, then they would demand potassium applications. How many of soils are testing in those types of ranges? Here, AgVise is using a 150 part per million. We can see about a quarter of the fields, but if Western Manitoba, only 10% of the fields are testing in a range where phosphorus or potassium application is really warranted and should be directed to. In other areas, it depends. If you have sandier soils, those are ones that are likely to be lower in natural potassium. So use your soil test to direct that effort. Our soil test works rather well for potassium by measuring the amount that's there on the clay and organic matter exchange sites. The one thing that sometimes we may overlook is that our recommendations that we have are based on, broadcast applications or starter or banded potassium. And what that reflects is those broadcast rates are higher. They're probably going to help move your soil test levels up quicker into a better working range. But if you're looking for just crop response in year of application, the band efficiency can give us about the same yield with half the rate of applied potassium. So if you're looking for a cost-saving measure, banding is the approach that can do that with potassium. You have some of these classic studies done. This is with barley in Saskatchewan, but looking at the yield increase of barley and added potassium here, depending how the potassium is applied, if it's seed placed or side banded, you get great yield response to modest rates. To get that same type of yield response to broadcast, we're needing, in this case, 4 times as much. So make sure that if you're needing potassium and you're not going to be building with the broadcast, that banding can be an efficient way to go. With sulfur, the soil test, we don't follow it a lot for sulfur because we have crops such as canola that are high demanding and high value, and so we often have insurance applications that go on crops like that. And then because sulfur cycles through the residue, it often will be sufficient to meet other crop needs. But if we're using sulfate sulfur, then we could look at a 1-year return on investment. That we expect to be available for use that year. As a number of elemental sulfur products or additions to fertilizer, there we need to look at a multi-year return on investment because it's not all going to be in a usable form for uptake in year 1, and we do not want to run short in the year 1 of application. Just a little bit of background on elemental sulfur, but the main thing is it requires warm temperatures, moist soil, kind of a neutral pH ideally, but very fine particle size and mixing with the soil, and time. And given time, that elemental form will convert to plant-available sulfate form. Traditionally, we had forms that were high analysis, but there's been new technology developments to speed conversions and additions to other fertilizers. And just a look at one of those studies that was conducted at Indian Head by Chris Holzaffel and team, and looks at some of these products that are mixtures of elemental sulfur or sulfate, and looking at the countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Saskatchewan. And in the far one, what they looked at was in year 1, where did the sulfur that got in the plant, where did it come from? Well, in year 1, it all came from sulfate form. In year 2, we're getting the majority of it coming from the elemental form. So good news. Return on investment? Yes, but be patient. In Argentina, which is probably more an environment like the Corn Belt, in year 1, most of the sulfur from sulfate, but seeing some elemental kicking out, and much more so in year 2. But if you're in Brazil, an environment like that, your sulfate sulfur is not very useful. It may well be leached away, but it's so warm that elemental will quite readily convert. So I don't know if climate change is coming, but that's it's the time, moisture, and environmental conditions that really accelerate and make the elemental functional. So I'm going to finish with just some micronutrients. Samir, copper, we have they're looking at copper levels. And Curtis, I see you in the front row there. You helped educate me on copper. About 30 years ago, we were looking at copper deficiency in your farm in the McGregor area. So And I always think of those Almasippi soils. Those are the ones that are quite characteristic, notoriously low in being naturally low in copper. And so typically done on a soil test, and if you are running low, and where our recommendations come from, there's some 102 experiments done with copper soils across the prairies. When soil test levels are very low, these are the yields from studies compared to 100% where copper was applied. These were the yields where there was no copper. So there's some absolute train wrecks on low testing soils, but as soil test levels build to 0.4 or 0.6, we're very close to where the responses are very modest or limited. So that's where our critical level is. If you have soils that are testing that low, that would be certainly warrant applications. Rigas Karamanis did a lot of that research to supply this slide, which we rarely use, but return on investment demands me to talk about this, Amir, and that is, what's the long-term effect of different sources? The first thing is the oxysulfate product they were using was rather inert in our high pH soils. So it was, you call that'd be a dud. Using chelated sources here, the green bars are the revenue, less the cost, and these dots are the marginal return, or this is the return per dollar spent. So using some of these chelates in the year of application, we're returning somewhere between $4 and $3 crop for expense of copper. Similarly, lower annual applications of sulfate. But the main one that I talk about, if you've got severe copper deficiencies, this is the batch application. This is the 5 to 8 pounds of copper sulfate that would be applied. So if you have a deficiency, you can fix it annually with some pretty good returns with your products, or you can fix it. This is like a farmer liming acidic soils. And so in the long term, if you look at over the course of 5 years here, the greatest profitability was due to fixing the problem with the copper sulfate application. Zinc is the other nutrient we need to keep an eye on. About half of our soils test less than 1 part per million. That's where we need zinc for corn. I just put, we don't have a lot of Manitoba data, but what we have shows that when corn tests less than 1 part per million zinc, it's very profitable to meet that need, and I'd encourage people to get zinc built into your program in order to address that. So soil testing is a part of all these decisions I was suggesting here. It's really important to predict crop needs, but it's also important as in the rear view mirrors and audit to look back to see how crops have done. If you're going to give yourself a mineralization benefit to organic matter, base it on your historic soil testing. If you have more carryover than you expect, you're probably getting organic matter contribution. Monitor also for nutrients. Long-term trends are more important than actually, particularly if you're entering into a building program, know when to take your foot off that gas pedal. Back to the 4 R's, Tom, and this is what you'll go over more on this. But again, farmers, there are strong returns on investment on fertilizer, strongest when we apply them or target them to deficient soils. And just remember that with nitrogen, we demand that return on investment in the year of application. For others, we need to be patient. And we have to look at the longer term, which we lack a lot of those long-term studies that look at what happens over time. And I'm glad that we have that from Adam Gurr and some others. I'm going to finish with that. I've said lots more than enough. Amir, thank you very much. So you can ask it.
So if there is any question, so we can maybe entertain one question. Because we have. Yep.
I can't hear well
Mic is
at the
coming.
best of times.
Yeah, low phosphate soil tests. Wondering if there was talk of possibly with the zero till and low mobility in the soil that we wouldn't be getting an accurate reading of the phosphate. Is there something to that?
Yeah, very good. I believe the question is, when you're soil testing zero-till fields, is that 0 to 6 inch sample giving you a good reflection of the actual phosphorus levels? And we do know in long-term zero-till, we do tend to stratify immobile nutrients closer to the surface. I know we don't do that much here in Manitoba, but if you're in areas where you were broadcasting fertilizer, you would tend to stratify. But simply through crop residue accumulation, the plant grows, it leaves residue at the surface, that's where we tend to. We actually did that sampling in Adams Field there, and we end up with about 2 times the concentration of phosphorus in the top 0 to 2 inches is what we have in the 2 to 6 inch sample. Do you adjust your rates accordingly? We say no. The recommendations are based on the total. Crops can still, particularly in a zero-till system where that has better moisture retention, still access those nutrients there. At a conference this December, we had a fellow up from Nebraska talking about, I know this is sacrilege to some zero-till farmers to hear that, but every once in a while we have perfect storms and wrecks, wet falls and things like that. So when you do have problems like with rutted fields or weeds you can't control anymore and things like that, and if we need to do tillage, that's our opportunity to hit the reset button again. And essentially, the environmentalists would probably be very happy if we simply flipped that high phosphorus layer down or mixed it in the soil. So there's no crime to doing periodic tillage. Our speaker showed that often as not, the yields sometimes benefit, providing you go back into that zero-till system and the attributes tend not to be lost. So that's an option.
Okay. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for coming.